high frame rate. That's what we're talking about today. This is James Gardner, the Senior Tech Geek, and in this video we're going to take advantage of Google's new functionality of allowing you to play high frame rate content. Now you need to be playing it better than 720 or 720 or better on a computer to actually see high frame rate, but so that's where you want to be watching this video. Now what we ended up doing, I actually wrote a long story about high frame rate quite a while ago that went on to Celluloid Junkie, a very good website to follow if you're a cinema tech geek like I am and want to track what's happening in the exhibition industry. So highly recommended. But on that blog, I was very bullish about high frame rate, and it really goes down to the fact that I saw high frame rate as a type of viewing feature. Like cinema has always been held up as one of the best places to see a film, and wouldn't it be good to say that, you know, if you wanted to see it with a new higher resolution, you know, more temporal resolution of high frame rate, well, you sort of have to go to the cinema to see that, because it's pretty much the only place you can today and probably for a reasonable amount of time into the future. But that traction hasn't really happened, and I wanted to look at why, or discuss probable reasons why the industry hasn't had any uptake in high frame rate. We've got a lot of talk from critics that they just don't like the look. It looks like video, etc. Now that is probably one perception. Me as a very technical person, I consider high frame rate. I look at it like the days when we went from SR audio, which is the two squiggly lines on the film with some Dolby magic going on there, to Dolby Digital, where we had the digital images between the sprockets and we came to a far better 5.1 true separation of sound. I went through a 5.1 Dolby Digital screening, and I'd never wanted to go back to an SR again. Why? Because there was a lot more information for me to hear. It was more realistic, because there was more information there. It made it more realistic. Well, in high frame rate, basically you can simulate the type of look that you get with film today with a certain motion blur, etc. But we're getting more information. You can see clearer into the motion of what people are doing, etc. Now, people say that looks more like video because that's what they want to do with football, etc., because people want to see what's happening in the plays. But at the same time, film is supposed to suspend disbelief. The more realistic it is, the better quality the sound, the better sharper the picture. That's supposed to bring us more and more into the environment. And I'm a bit surprised that high frame rate has not been accepted as such. Other aspects of high frame rate which the industry is yet to take on is that now we've got all these things like high dynamic range, higher resolutions, 4K and beyond. And in a lot of the, SMPTE, and if you follow those sort of technical tracks of what's going on there, high frame rate is very much part of what's going to be happening when we actually come to see more of those higher quality standards. And specifically because once we do up the ante and all those different bits of quality, the stutter effect that you see due to the 24 frames a second and panning the camera is exponentially made even worse. And to undo that, we have to go to high frame rates. So high frame rates will have to come. It's going to have to come because if all this other, as we push forward into better quality, we'll need to do high frame rates to reduce the problems with doing so at 24 frames a second. But now let's look at high frame rate as a tool. Realistically, when you see this talk about high frame rates in the sense of production, high frame rates really at the end of the day is nothing more than another tool in the box of a filmmaker's box of tricks. It can bring a different emotional effect, or it can bring in a different way of looking at the content, etc. And I think that's probably the biggest issue with why high frame rate hasn't happened sooner, because the producers, the directors, are yet to realize how to properly use that new tool at its most effective level. And they're not really sure how it will affect the viewer and the emotional effect, etc. So that's still a learning curve, and that's what we're still behind. And that's probably what's the the gap between why we haven't got it yet. Now, because of that, I went out and I said to some local filmmakers here, let's talk about high frame rate, why they didn't like it, how they looked at it, etc. So we went out and we said, I want to shoot some high frame rate, and I'm going to tell you how to use the camera to make it more, probably more appealing to what you're used to, because they've basically been exposed to the very initial exposure to high frame rate, where it's been the negative, it looks like video, blah 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 blah, but not really played with it themselves. They need to understand it, and one of the reasons I'm putting this video up, it's just a test file, but it's to help producers and shooters understand high frame rate and how they can use it. I'm sure everyone will get to this at some stage, so I just wanted to put this up so people can see. In this video, we basically went down to a skate park. I went with two other guys, Bart Borghese, he's a director-producer, and Matt Wood, he's a shooter, and then we used his DJI gimbal. It was the first time we went out with it. It was the first we wanted to test it. We hadn't used it before, and his Red Epic. And we went out there, and I asked Bart exactly what sort of, how would you shoot this if you were going to shoot it for a music video, which is, he's done a lot of music videos in the past. And he said, I'd probably go in with a 1/25th of a second, of course, because it's PAL country, at 180 degree shutter. Basically, that equates to 1/50th of a second exposure. So I went and we shot some of that. And then, we went, let's now turn the camera on to, let's double the frame rate, so it's going to be easier to make a video to compare, and we'll go to 1/5th of a second frame, 50 frames a second. But their natural reaction was just to change the frame rate and not affect the shutter angle. And these are smart guys, but they're just not used to this new way of thinking. They're set in their ways. They've been doing it forever. So I said, no, let's change the shutter angle so we get exactly the same exposure. So we should have exactly the same effect, and that's exactly what happened. We shot 25 frames a second and 50 frames a second, and it was 180 degrees at 25 and 360 degree shutter at 50 frames a second, which equates to exactly the same exposure. And in our tests, if we took the high frame rate, 50 frames a second, and we took every second frame, obviously it looked exactly the same as if we only shot 25 frames a second. So there's a good understanding to start off with. So you understand that prospect or aspect of the situation. Now that we were shooting 50 frames a second, the only real difference is that we had the same look that that Bart initially wanted, but now we just had a lot more frames with that look. And I think that's a very important, simple thing for filmmakers to understand and to get used to and get their hands on with, so they can start feeling and start building upon how it's going to work in productions and in the art of making films and the storytelling of it and the tool that is in your toolbox. So that's why I wanted to make this video, because I'd like to see high frame rate. I'm a very big fan of high frame rate. I think making a traditional action film in traditional way, but with more frames, with higher frame rate, would be an interesting thing to watch. The Hobbit is a very interesting film, but it tried to do too much on too many aspects. It was high frame rate, it's massive amounts of CGI, it's a fantasy world with funny color grading effects, etc. And all that mixed together, people found a reason to dislike it for there were so many different reasons that someone could probably find to dislike it. I think it was it was not a very good first film to go out with, because it didn't really help the industry understand the technology. So I'd like to see people make like a traditional, like a good old Rambo or a something like that, like a Die Hard, in a high frame rate type effect with action scenes, more detail, etc. Would look amazing. I'd really like to see something like that. The younger generation, for example, they expect everything to be in high frame rate because that's, they're watching a lot more games now and doing a lot of other things on with their multiple media systems, and a lot of that's at 60 frames per second already. And so they consider 24 like we consider. I consider my dad used to listen to Glenn Miller, and that's pretty old hat and pretty strange, and maybe our kids will think that we like to watch 24 frames a second stuff is pretty old hat and pretty strange. So it's all a matter of perspective and what you grew up with. So I hope you enjoy the video and have a look at the test footage. I must remark before I continue that this was only very much of a test footage. We really needed some ND filters. It was too hot, and we really the DJI Ronin was the first time we had set out with it. We hadn't really used it before, and we needed to tweak it, but we didn't have the password or something at the time to make it easier to control with the actions. So considering all those limitations, we still had something that was interesting in my book. I still wanted to put it up there so people could get a feel for what the aim was and what the results were, so they can get a better understanding of how to use these tools. So high frame rate, I think we should try and embrace it sooner than later, because it will encourage people to go to the cinema, and because I can't see high frame rate at home yet, but I know it's coming fast and furious by the consumer electronics people, because they want to come up with new reasons to sell new televisions as quickly as possible. But the best place to make use of high frame rate is on the big screen, because that's where the motion artifacts are most likely to offend. So that's James Gardner with a Cinetech Geek video. I know this is covering a little bit more of the production side, and I'm hoping to do a little bit more like that in the future. But I will always focus on exhibition, and how exhibition as a business can continue and expand and grow. Thanks for listening. Bye for now. DCP Player free. Get it now from digital.net.au.